Alright, welcome back. So this is going to be video 3 of the 5-video part on blood. So what we're gonna switch gears a little bit here, and we are going to talk about white blood cells. So remember, we're still talking about the formed element component of the blood, and remember, formed elements makes up about 45% of the total blood volume. All right, so for a whole blood sample, 45% is going to be formed elements, and then 55% is going to be plasma. We're talking about white blood cells or leukocytes here. So these cells are going to be our anti-pathogenic cells. So these are the cells that help us resist infection. Okay, and remember that these cells are cells that are going to live anywhere between days to years, depending on the particular cell and what its function is. So just like we talked about with red blood cells, I want to mention with respect to white blood cells this process of production of these cells, and that is called leukapheresis. Okay, so leukapheresis, just like erythropoiesis, is increasing the number of leukocytes. All right, leukapheresis occurs in the red bone marrow. Okay, just like erythropoiesis did. What's going to stimulate the increase of leukopoiesis? Well, we saw that erythropoiesis was stimulated really largely by a hormone called erythropoietin. All right, leukopoiesis is going to largely be stimulated by our exposure to pathogens. Okay, so if we get infected with something, and we're getting infected with things all of the time, we are going to increase our amounts of white blood cells. Okay, depending on the pathogen that infects us, that's going to determine which types of white blood cells will be increased in number. But that process is largely controlled through hormones and also through this process of getting infected with a pathogen. Okay, so what is the job of a white blood cell? What does a white blood cell do for us? Well, it identifies foreign material. So we can recognize that we've been invaded or infected with a particular pathogen, and we then, in response to that, we can mount an inflammatory response. And inflammation is an extremely important component of the immune response. So what happens? Let's take a look at this image on the left-hand side. And just to remind you where leukapheresis takes place is, remember that it's taking place in the red bone marrow, right, of the adult. So heads of the femur and humerus, and also the axial skeleton, the sternum, and the vertebral bodies. So if we take a look at inflammation, how does this happen? Okay, so the first thing is we break the external barrier, which is our skin. And when we do this, in some way, we introduce pathogen to the tissue. Okay, so we can see the pathogens here, these kind of little blue bar shaped structures. And when that happens, white blood cells that are flowing through the blood vessels in that area, they start to sprout little receptor molecules that tell white blood cells that are flowing through the bloodstream, this area of tissue is infected. And as a result, white blood cells can go through a process called margination. And what margination is essentially the white blood cell, it rolls along and adheres to the vessel wall. And that vessel wall is the area nearby where that tissue has been infected. After the white blood cell rolls along, we can see that as number 1 here. The white blood cell is going to squeeze through little clefts or little openings in the in the blood vessel, and this process is called diapedesis. Okay, so the white blood cell is going to squeeze into the tissue from the blood vessel. So it's now entering the tissue, and it does so, and it is attracted to chemicals. So these are kind of response chemicals or response signals by damaged tissue that attract a white blood cell to an area of infection. This is called chemotaxis. So the white blood cell essentially sniffs out the damaged tissue by this process called chemotaxis. Okay? And it's positively attracted to this area, so sometimes you might hear it referred to as positive chemotaxis. Once the white blood cell gets there, the white blood cell that was drawn to the area can secrete chemicals called cytokines. And these cytokines are going to be secreted, so we can see number 4 here. Okay, the white blood cell is going to be dumping out chemicals called cytokines, and these cytokines are secreted from white blood cells. They're also secreted from other cells in the area that are trying to invoke or increase an inflammatory response. Okay, and eventually we can get cells to the area that can deal with the foreign material. All right, so let's take a look at these different types of white blood cells. All right, so these white blood cells, remember, we're going to come from 2 different cell lines, and the cell lines we're coming from, white blood cells are going to come from both the myeloid and the lymphoid cell line. All right, there are 2 different types of white blood cells, granulocytes and agranulocytes. We're going to take the granulocytes first. So granulocyte refers to the fact that all of these types of white blood cells, they all have cytoplasmic granules within their cytoplasms. And each one of those cells has a particular granule, particular chemicals in these little bags within their cytoplasms that contain chemicals that can help deal with a particular invader. And neutrophils. So let's take the granulocytes from top to bottom here. Neutrophils are, or otherwise known as polymorphonuclear cells, because oftentimes they have multi-lobed nuclei. Okay, multiple nuclei or multi-lobed nuclei. Neutrophils are going to be our most common or our most numerous white blood cell. All right, so if you were to take a blood sample and do a blood smear and look at those, the blood under a microscope, the most common white blood cell that you would see is the neutrophil. These neutrophils are really good at dealing with bacterial infections, so we might see an increase in neutrophils during bacterial infections. Also, these types of white blood cells are very common in acute infection. So if you get infected with something, the first type of white blood cell that's going to be elevated is the neutrophil. They are usually first on the scene of an infection. Okay, so in the previous slide, we saw neutrophils going through margination, diapedesis, and chemotaxis, and moving to an area where pathogen invaded. So they're first on the scene. They're also very, very phagocytic, okay, which means that they are going to take in foreign material from their environment, namely pathogen, break that pathogen apart, and kind of move around and clean up the area. Okay, so what's unique about their structure is they've got these kind of multi-lobed nuclei. Eosinophils. So in eosinophil, the cytoplasmic granules stain red in nature. Okay, and eosinophils, the nucleus has been referred to oftentimes, or is referred to oftentimes, as looking like an old handheld phone receiver from the original, some of the originally produced phones, telephones. And eosinophils are very good at dealing with parasitic worm infections. So what they do is, with their cytoplasmic granules, they'll dump those granules onto a large parasite. So for example, if you ate some meat that was uncooked, that could contain cysts from a particular parasitic worm, that those cysts could eventually mature into a large, full-sized parasitic worm. Those eosinophils are going to dump their cytoplasmic contents onto those large parasites and break them down into smaller pieces so that phagocytic cells can take care of them. Eosinophils, we also see increase in number in allergic reactions. So for example, if someone who has asthma goes through an allergic reaction, we can look at the tissue in the respiratory passageways, and we'd see large numbers of eosinophils in the area. Basophils. So basophils are our least common of the white blood cells. Okay, so only about 1%, less than 1%, about half of a percent or so of all of your white blood cells are going to be basophils. But they've got a very important job to do. Their cytoplasmic granules contain a chemical called histamine. Okay, and histamine is a vasodilator, so it causes blood vessels to dilate. Okay, and what that does is, if a vessel dilates, it increases blood flow to an area. Okay, and that also increases inflammation in an area, and that's good because inflammation is a very important key to the immune response. You may have taken medications that are antihistamine, all right, and what that does is, for example, if you're congested, that may be because your basophils are releasing lots of their histamine, and they're doing so because you're allergic or you have a sensitivity to something in your nasal passages. Well, if you take an antihistamine, what that's going to do is it's going to prevent the basophils from being able to dump their histamine into the affected area, and that's going to help to decrease mucus and decrease the flow of fluid from vessels. Natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are also granulocytes, all right, oftentimes referred to as NK cells. Their cytoplasmic granules are very good at essentially killing and dealing with foreign cells, cancerous cells, and virus-infected cells. So what natural killer cells do is they deal with cells that are largely abnormal. Okay, and what happens is if a natural killer cell recognizes that a cell is abnormal, it will dump out its cytoplasmic contents. Okay, so the granular contents will be dumped onto a cell, all right, and that will cause the cell that they're dumped onto to undergo something called apoptosis, which is where the cell will essentially undergo a programmed cell death. Okay, agranulocytes. So agranulocytes do not have cytoplasmic granules. The types of white blood cells that we see do not have cytoplasmic granules. One of them are called lymphocytes. There are two different varieties of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells. These are going to be our really important cells that are going to help us have long-term immunity to a particular pathogen. The way that we're able to get rid of these pathogens with lymphocytes is we use antibodies. So antibodies are potent Y-shaped proteins that can mark pathogens for destruction and help limit the ability of foreign invaders to increase in number in our bodies. Another type of agranulocyte is a monocyte. Okay, monocytes are pretty big white cells. They are very, very active phagocytes. They're our most active phagocytes. They are very good at dealing with cleaning up foreign invaders from tissues and also cleaning up cellular debris and other dead organelles or tissues. They become macrophages once they get into tissues. So a monocyte moves into a tissue and it becomes a macrophage. I'm just going to write MAC. Okay. All right, so how do we remember these cells and in what order we might see them in? Well, we know that the neutrophils are the most common and the basophils are the least common. Well, where do the others fall in line? A good mnemonic to remember is never let monkeys eat bananas. Okay, so never is our neutrophils. Okay, they are the most common. Bananas are our basophils. Those are the least common. Okay, and the others fall in between. So L is our lymphocytes, M are our monocytes, and E are our eosinophils. Okay, So that kind of gives you a little mnemonic for remembering the order in which these cells are found as far as how numerous they're found in the blood.